Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and thank you all for joining us, particularly our members, for this on-the-record discussion of Vladimir Putin's long game in Ukraine, one of the critical importance to understanding what's happening in the conflict so far and where we can think this conflict will be going in the future. If you'd like to submit a question to today's panel, please visit us at ccga.live on your browser. Type in your question or vote for one that's already there. Just to remember, the Council, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, in fact, tomorrow, we will have a formal celebration, is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform, and the views that you hear here are those of the individuals and not of the Council. I'm really pleased to be joined by three exceptional people in this conversation, all friends who have analyzed this for many years. First off, Carl Bildt, who is the co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations and served as Prime Minister as well as Foreign Minister of Sweden. He also was a EU Special Envoy for the former Yugoslavia, who was the first High Representative to Bosnia and Herzegovina and a UN Special Envoy to the Balkans. And of course, was the co-chair of the Dayton Peace Conference, which brought peace to another major war in Europe. Also joining us today is Angela Stent. She is the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. Her academic work focuses on the triangular political and economic relationship between the United States, Russia, and Europe. And I am pleased to say she was one of my professors, one of the best I've ever had. Finally, will be moderated today by Bianna Golodryga, who serves as the senior global affairs analyst and fill-in anchor for CNN and based in New York. Prior to joining CNN full-time, Bianna was co-anchor of the weekend edition of ABC's Good Morning America and co-host of CBS This Morning. Bianna's going to do the moderating, so over to you. And thanks again to our speakers for joining us, and importantly, for all of you for tuning in and being part of this. Thanks all.
Ivo, thank you. And thank you to the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs for hosting this really important conversation. Unfortunately, we are now in day 4 of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. And it is a scenario I think few of us that have followed this region for many years could have even imagined a month ago. And yet here we are. And I wish there were better circumstances to start this conversation today, each day, as we're trying to look for a way out than seeing these images out of Mariupol during a period where both sides had agreed on sort of a free evacuation zone for civilians to get out. Now we were seeing images of a maternity ward that had been bombed. And we're hearing reports from the Ukrainian side that women and children are casualties here. So let's start there on that note. If I can just turn to Angela and ask you the $64,000 question. You know, that same question a month ago was, what is Putin thinking and will he invade? Well, now we know the answer to that. And I guess the subsequent follow-up question to that would be, how does this all end? How do you see this playing out?
Well, thank you, Bianna, and thank you, Ivo, one of my best former students, for inviting me to be on this panel. I mean, I'm afraid that Putin's endgame still appears to be as it was on February 23rd, which is the subjugation of Ukraine, putting in power a government that's pro-Russian and that declares its neutrality and no longer seeks to join the West or have a democratic political system. And that really is the first phase of what he wants. His ambitions are greater. I'm sure they extend to creating a Slavic state with Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And then we can talk later on about whether they extend further west. And so even all of the setbacks that the Russian military has seen in the past 13 days don't seem to have changed his mind. Yesterday, we had the chiefs of our intelligence services testifying to Congress and saying things are going to get worse. And Putin doesn't seem to be swayed by anything that's happening on the ground, if indeed he knows what's happening on the ground. So his aim game, I think, hasn't changed. It may be very difficult for him to achieve it.
Yeah, Carl, on that note, we heard from CIA Director Burns yesterday alluding to frustration that the CIA is from sources within the Kremlin that this is not going according to plan, and this is not how Vladimir Putin had seen this operation unfold. And now we're into day 14, where we only have one city that the Russians have been able to secure in this country. So that having been said, what is your take on what steps can be taken next, on the one hand, to continue to show a united front from the West, from the United States, NATO, et cetera, in punishing Russia for its actions, but also perhaps leaving a window of opportunity for this to come to an end?
I think it's right to say that, and Angela was on it, that he has very far-reaching aims with operation in Ukraine. He is still determined to achieve those aims. There are no signs of him wavering in any sort of way, in spite of the fact that Ukrainian resistance has proved to be more difficult for him to deal with than I think anticipated. And certainly Western actions of different sorts have become far more than I think any one of us in this discussion anticipated. But he intends to press on, and his inclination will be to escalate in the different ways in which he can escalate. He has already the bulk of the entire Russian army deployed in Ukraine. He would need to deploy even more of the Russian army in order to possibly grind down over a prolonged period of time the Ukrainian army. I don't think there will be any opening for diplomacy until he or someone around him says that this doesn't really work. And in the meantime, the Western strategy, the only one that I see as possible, is first to sort of increase the pressure on him in different ways, that's sanctions and whatever we can do, and increase support for Ukraine. There's a military element of that, so that's very significant, but there's also a financial element to it, keeping the Ukrainian state sort of still a viable state, doing what states are supposed to do. And a third element, I would say, the diplomatic outreach. I mean, there's a lot going on with China at the moment, also from the European side. I think we need to talk with the Indians and a couple of others. And do all of this with endurance and strength until there's some sort of change that makes diplomacy come into the play again. But we are not there yet.
Ivo, picking up on that, we have seen the Israeli prime minister, right, fly out to Moscow over the weekend. There have been phone conversations between Vladimir Putin and Emmanuel Macron. As Carl noted, that we're hearing more from the Chinese side. It's notable, though, that we have seen from the United States and from the Biden administration, from Biden himself, him saying that he has no plans on speaking with Vladimir Putin anytime soon, given that Vladimir Putin sees himself as a co-equal with only one other world leader, and that being the president of the United States. Do you see an opportunity, perhaps, for a possible phone conversation between the two leaders sometime soon?
I don't really, because I think the situation needs to change significantly for Vladimir Putin to be interested in a serious diplomatic conversation. I think one of the interesting things we're seeing is when President Macron gets on the phone, which he's doing quite a lot with President Putin, and has been doing now for quite a while. Everything that we hear from those conversations is that Macron comes away convinced that Putin is dug in deeply, not really willing to consider any alternative to the path that he is currently on. And that just suggests that there just is no opening to have that conversation. I'm normally someone who believes that the president should be able and willing to talk to anyone. I don't think that we talk to people because it's a favor to them, which sometimes is in the U.S. debate. But it's got to have some purpose. I think the purpose of the calls before the war were to warn Putin of the consequences. Of course, Putin didn't listen, or at least he dismissed those consequences. I'm far more interested in what Carl said, which is the U.S. Engaging in particular with the Chinese, and I hope we are talking to them very quietly. Of course, Secretary Blinken has been talking to his counterpart, but more importantly, other folks very quietly talking to the Chinese, because they have the leverage to change Putin's disposition, it seems to me. One other point I just want to point out: we're only 14 days into this conflict. And I think we're all surprised by both the slowness of the Russian advance and the extraordinary heroism of the Ukrainians. But we have to be realistic. All of the forces that were deployed on Russian and Belarusian soil, and virtually all of them are now inside Ukraine. About 92 to 95% of the combat power that Russia had is still intact. It hasn't used its air force in any degree one would have expected, or cyber, or a lot of other things, and all of that can still be unleashed over time. We are at the very beginning of a very brutal war, and it seems to me that Vladimir Putin is perfectly willing, as he demonstrated in Chechnya when he leveled Grozny, and more recently in Syria when he leveled Aleppo. He's perfectly willing to do the same to Ukraine. I think that's the reality that we're facing.
So, Angela, here we see sort of the similar MO from the Russian military, right? And Vladimir Putin, to this point, still accountable to no one at home, and still commands power. We're not seeing any signs of fissures within his circle. That having been said, as disillusioned as isolated as he may be in a bubble, having placed himself in a position of only being told news that he wants to hear, there's no way that 14 days in that he can't understand that things aren't going according to plan, that he may not have anticipated to see some of the difficulties that the Russian military is experiencing against a far inferior military, and that is the Ukrainian. The amount of sanctions coming in from the West, the freezing, right, of their central bank, and the assets that they've accumulated and stockpiled there. The Russian stock market continues to be closed for its longest period of time. I'm curious to get your take as somebody who studied him for so long. What could possibly be going on inside the Kremlin and for him as he's trying to grasp with all of this unfolding?
Well, of course, that's a question we'd all like to know the answer to. Before I answer it, let me just tell you that today, President Xi Jinping used the word war to describe what was going on between Russia and Ukraine. That could get him 15 years in prison now in Russia. So maybe the Chinese are rethinking some of their support for Russia in this war. As far as we can see, Putin remains isolated. I think no one's quite sure where he is at the moment. He really may not know what is going on. Clearly, we know that the armed forces, particularly the conscripts, were not prepared for this war. The people around Putin told him it was going to be over in 72 hours. They would have taken Kyiv by then. They even had the article in RIA Novosti, a government-run media outlet, 2 days after the war began, talking about how easy it had been to win and how the Ukrainians had welcomed the Russians and surrendered. So they've since taken that article down. So they weren't, I think, prepared for it. And he really may not know how badly the army is doing. He's making, contradictory statements. I think he's now said that all the conscripts have been withdrawn from Ukraine and it's just professional soldiers. I think we don't really know whether that is true or not. So the issue that we have to ask is, who is giving him this information, and do they know what's really going on? Does the defense minister Shoigu know what's going on and he's not telling President Putin because that's not what he wants to hear? Or maybe he does not know either. He does know, of course, about the sanctions. Of course, he's made these threats now saying that sanctions are an existential threat to the Russian state, and he may have to use, means of responding to that, the like of which we've never seen before. So he's obviously raised all these questions about the potential use of nuclear weapons. This doesn't fit really a very coherent picture in terms of what Russian strategy might be going forward, given the setbacks that the Russian military has encountered. So I think one does have to question whether he really understands what's going on.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's sort of a black eye now internally, where you've seen the Russian military come out after Vladimir Putin made that statement that no conscripts, right, were involved in this fighting. For now, they came out today and said, unfortunately, there have been conscripts. So to see that admission is something that you rarely see, and gives you a sense of just the instability there as they're trying to just follow events as they're unfolding and figuring out a narrative to relay to Russians there at home. Carl, let me get you to respond to one thing that Bloomberg was reporting just an hour ago, and that is that a top policy aide to President Zelensky said Ukraine is open to discussing Russia's demand of neutrality as long as it's given security guarantees, though it won't surrender a single inch of territory. So that to me suggests, whether that's not recognizing Donbass as part of Russia or even Crimea, but the idea that they would talk about neutrality seems to be something new here. Do you think that this is a change in tone that we're seeing from the Zelensky administration, and how do you think that would be received in the Kremlin?
I don't think that's going to be enough from the Kremlin point of view. Even if you take these statements that are coming out from the Putin press spokesman, and several of them, they indicate that the demands include recognition of Crimea, recognition of the sort of independent Donbass, the statelets or gangster republic or whatever we call them. And obviously Zelensky not prepared to concede on those things. And he demands, of course, the withdrawal of all of the Russian forces from the territory of Ukraine. That's fairly self-evident. As to neutrality, I mean, we should not forget that even if sort of Ukraine had applied for NATO membership, everyone knew that this was not an issue that was on the table. I remember having a conversation with Zelensky personally on this. And he said, well, it's there, but we know and whatever, it's not the thing. So I think he would probably be prepared to back down on that somewhat, particularly in the recognition that he knows that NATO is not open to it. And as long as that is a sort of a voluntary decision by the Ukrainian political leadership itself, it would of course be okay from the Western point of view, because we are defending the right of every nation to decide its own security policy orientation. But I don't think that is enough, because as Angela said initially, if you listen to what Putin has said, his aims on Ukraine are much more far-reaching than either Donbass or Crimea or NATO. It's really that he's deeply uncomfortable with the existence of Ukraine as an independent political entity, because that is contrary to his vision of restoring a 19th century Russian and Slavic empire. And that's what he really aims at with this operation.
Ivo, if I could get you to weigh in on how this is playing out in terms of the media landscape in the United States and in Europe as well. We have seen a shift in terms of polling amongst Americans, at least, that do seem to favor support for Ukraine, whereas just a few months ago, you didn't see that number anywhere near where I think it's about 60% or so. It was about 30% a few months ago. Clearly, the images that Americans at least are seeing on their television screens are impacting them. And now you're seeing bipartisan support for more U.S. aid. And even if that means obviously cutting off Russian oil imports to the United States, even though that number is fairly minimal, that you are seeing gas prices start to rise here. I'm just curious, how much longer do you think that the Biden administration can withstand more perhaps pressure from Democrats and Republicans to not do more? Obviously, there's the question of the no-fly zones and delivering of planes. I mean, what else, in theory, could the U.S. be doing, given that the president laid down a landmark saying that there aren't going to be U.S. troops involved?
Yeah, I think this is the really important question, and to see how public and elite opinion is changing. If you look at Europe, public opinion and elite opinion has gone through an absolute 180-degree turn, far more than in the United States. In part because what is happening is nearer geographically, but in part because it was so contrary to the way people thought behavior in the 21st century Europe would take place. And memories are short, and Carl, of course, remembers just as well what was happening in the former Yugoslavia. But this is different. This is a big power deciding to use force to take over a small power with a degree of brutality that we have rarely seen in modern European history. And the reaction has been extraordinary. I mean, the kinds of things that people are talking about in Europe everyone dismissed a week, 10 days or 2 weeks ago, including, for example, now a proposal by the European Commission to reduce gas imports from natural gas imports from Russia by 2/3 within a year. That is a humongous, major change in the way to think about it. The question I think that you're posing is there a limit to what we're willing to do? And the search for sort of Goldilocks kind of military intervention, whether it's a no-fly zone, which is the perennial favorite of people who want to help, and yet it has very little impact on the actual fighting on the ground. Most of the fighting and most of the killing is being done with ground capabilities, artillery, rockets, missiles, rather than bombs being dropped from airplanes. In fact, very few bombs are being dropped from airplanes.
Wait, so let me interrupt you just on that point, because why do we keep hearing then from Zelensky pleading with world leaders, with the public, as he's done so effectively and emotionally over the past week or so, if not longer, that his number one ask right now is for that no-fly zone? Because
there is this myth. And it's a myth that we have and they're being perpetuated by many people on TV, that somehow a no-fly zone is going to have an impact on the fighting. I mean, for one, a no-fly zone, if it's real, will involve having to take out Russian targets, whether inside Ukraine or outside or in Russia itself. It would mean shooting down Russian airplanes if they come into the zone that you're trying to defend. But for another, the reality is, even if you were totally successful in establishing a no-fly zone, much of the fighting is not happening in the air or from the air. It's happening from the ground. And so the pressure would be that the moment you have a no-fly zone, to say, well, you really ought to go after Russian artillery and Russian missile systems and Russian rocket systems. And we've seen this movie before. And Carl will remember that. He was a foreign minister when I was at NATO as the ambassador, when people were calling for a no-fly zone over Libya and saying, oh my God, we need to help the Libyan people through a no-fly zone. And it was President Obama in a meeting inside the White House Situation Room said, well, let me get this straight. Aren't people being killed by tanks and artillery and machine guns rather than bombs being dropped? So if we really want to do something, we actually need to take out the Libyan military that is attacking the people. If you want to really help the Ukrainian people, you need to be prepared to go to war against Russia. And we weren't prepared before the war by putting our troops in there, which probably would have deterred, by the way, a Russian attack. And I remember Carl and I in a conversation that not that long ago, arguing about, not arguing, saying, if you want to do that, that's what you want to do. Before the fact. But before the war, you should have put in if you put in 2, 3, 4 U.S. divisions into Ukraine, you would have dissuaded the attack. But now we're trying to find a way to do something which we're not prepared to do, which is to fight the Russian army. And if you want to win this war, you help the Ukrainians as much as you can. But ultimately, the only way to win this war is to go after the Russians. And no one, as far as I know, is prepared to do that.
So, Angela, then, if having a U.S. or NATO presence inside Ukraine would have deterred Russia going in, and given the reality that we're now seeing, where one of the world's top militaries has to go into week 2, perhaps week 3 now, of a battle for a much more inferior country, and the Russian military is not performing as many had anticipated, why do you think Russia would be open to a fight with the West and the United States in particular?
Do I think that Russia would be open to a fight with the West? I'm not sure, by the way, if we put U.S. troops in there, that Russia wouldn't have invaded. I think Putin has been sort of hell-bent on doing this for a long time, and he happened to choose this as a moment when he thought that the West was weak. I think Putin, is prepared possibly to come into a conflict with the West. I worry about this war unintentionally spreading to one of Ukraine's neighbors, the easternmost frontline states of NATO, to Poland, maybe to the Baltic states, maybe to Romania. And if you look at the performance of the Russian army so far, I'm not sure they would show the kind of restraint that would be needed for that not to happen. So the burden is obviously on the NATO countries to try and make sure that doesn't happen. Hence, reluctance to facilitate the supply of MiG jets to Ukraine. Hence, repeatedly President Biden saying no U.S. troops, even though obviously we're reinforcing the frontline NATO states and we are sending our troops there. So I think Putin believes he's already in conflict with the West. He's believed that he's been in conflict with the West for a long time, at least since he gave his speech at the Munich Security Conference 15 years ago. And so I think that's really not a deterrent to him. And I do think that his sights go further than Ukraine and Belarus. If you look at the ultimatums that were delivered in December to the West, the demand that NATO retreat to where it was in 1997. So it's really sort of rolling back much of what has happened since the Soviet Union collapsed.
Carl, you agree?
I unfortunately agree. I think his immediate aims, the obvious aim, where he's been very clear, is Ukraine. And that is part of his vision of the Russian state that he wants to create. But then having created that, I mean, talking theoretically, he wants a security perimeter around that particular state. And as said, we should look carefully at what he's saying in public. And the fact that he's put this 1997 on the table, that indicates that that's what he aims at. I consider that totally unrealistic, but we should be realistic in assessment of what he actually wants to do. And he's prepared to escalate quite far, as long as he believes there's any even small chance of winning this. Because he knows that the alternative for him, the alternative to winning, is actually losing. And losing could mean losing the Russian state as such.
So then, Carl, how does the West respond to that? Because clearly that is not an option for the West to see forward, right, and to allow. So where is that period of detente, or that stopping point where you can have Vladimir Putin take an off-ramp if need be, right? Because no one's talking about the business of regime change now coming from the outside, but at the same time, not fulfilling his long-term plan of pushing NATO back to 97 borders.
Well, what's happening now is, of course, and Eva knows more about this from his background, NATO is beefing up in the different the Baltic states, in Poland, the US substantially, in Romania. I think we need to give more attention to Moldova, which I think might be sort of the next in line if it succeeds the one way or other with Ukraine. Then it's a question, of course, of conducting what I saw that the Russians accused us of yesterday, economic warfare. It is economic warfare. It is substantial economic warfare that we are conducting against Russia. And then beefing up as much as we can Ukraine. I mean, there are supplies that are significant. Sweden has delivered 5,000 fairly powerful anti-tank weapons. Say that 20 of them hit their targets. That's going to take out 1,000 Russian vehicles. I mean, these things are going to have an impact. And I think we need to also consider training, because some of these weapon systems might be slightly more advanced. And then you can do training. I see nothing really that should prevent us from doing that also inside Ukraine at the invitation of the Ukrainian government that has the legitimacy of the United Nations. So there should be no legal problems associated with that. So training, supplying, financial support to ensure the viability of the existing Ukrainian state structures. And if that is the key combination with economic warfare, I think that might prevent him from capturing entire Ukraine. He will probably deploy more of the Russian army. But whether he will really be able to capture all of Ukraine, I consider, had you asked me 2 weeks ago, I said he could do it. I would say the likelihood now of him being able to do it is less than I thought 2 weeks ago.
And Ivo, we heard Carl mention Moldova, which is a country where I was born, and very poor country and one of the poorest, if not poorest, in Europe. It's got a GDP of about $11 billion. And they've seen a large influx of these refugees now coming in from Ukraine. And they also have a separatist region, Transnistria, where there had been a civil war years before even, the Donbass conflict there. Do you foresee a scenario where all of a sudden you have Russia once again encroaching into Moldova, not a member of NATO? And effectively, also, let's not forget about Belarus, which is a satellite of Russia's at this point anyway.
Well, I think if he succeeds in Ukraine, then those are the two next steps, Moldova and Belarus. And I think he is at a very minimum trying to draw a new iron curtain from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, sort of at the eastern end of NATO territory, the three Baltic states, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and then over into Romania, northern Romania, onto the Black Sea. I think that's what he's trying to do as a first step, and then push further to enhance influence. Perhaps not militarily, but politically and in other ways by trying to divide the West. And that's why I think the response from the West has been so important to demonstrate that, in fact, no, we're all standing together. We all are not only saying that we are going to defend our own territory, which is one thing with regard to NATO and NATO membership, but we're also going to make sure that the cost on Russia keeps on going up. It is economic warfare. It's another form of economic warfare. There's a political warfare going on too, which is UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions and diplomatic engagement with countries to pull them to the anti-Russian side very openly, very actively, even with Venezuela. And places like that, not just because of oil, but just because to undermine the Russian capacity. I also agree with Angela. I just want to make clear that people understand that I don't think that Putin is about to give in, and that he's willing to escalate in ways that I frankly don't think we will, and we are willing to do. So one of the reasons I'm drawing this line of our direct military involvement, which includes the no-fly zone, is because I worry about escalation. I worried about a nuclear war. I think we are closer to that possibility than almost any time in my lifetime. I was around in the Cuban Missile Crisis, pretty young, but I was around. So, but that's going back a long time. And so I worry about, let's just do a little bit here and a little bit there. This is a mighty Russian army. They may not have been able to do as much as they did beforehand, but boy, can they do a lot of damage. And we need to be very careful about that. I think the point is to contain him, to have counter pressure, and ultimately, and I'd love to see what Angela's view is, ultimately provide sort of the internal dynamics of change in Russia, because that, frankly, is the only way this is going to end.
Yeah, and I'll have Angela pick up on this, and then we'll take viewers' questions. And I guess it's sort of a two-pronged question I have for you, Angela, because on the question of, how concerned should we be about this going to the next level, and that being nuclear, I just find it so hard to wrap my head around the idea of a nuclear war or nuclear exchange, right, fired from the direction of the Russians, obviously knowing what the response would be, when we're dealing with a leader who is so paranoid about his own health that he still is sitting, 50 feet away from anybody at these long tables, so concerned about COVID and sort of a paranoia. So that for me, I'm not describing him as a rational player anymore at this point. Clearly he's not, but I still don't know if I'm ready to be comfortable with the terminology of nuclear warfare possibly being at its heightened level, the levels we haven't seen in decades. So I'd like for you to respond to that. And second, just given your expertise in Russia, talk about the consequence of these massive sanctions, right? And what's going on internally in Russia to its economy. Talk about a shock effect, right? Overnight, we're seeing companies leaving left, right, and center, not to mention just the suppression there and the lack of any sort of independent media whatsoever, people leaving the country in droves. What does that all lead to in the near and far term?
Okay, thanks. So, on the nuclear war question, obviously we all assume that any rational leader, particularly of one of the world's two nuclear superpowers, understands that nuclear weapons are there for deterrence, but actually not to be used because of the, unimaginable consequences for Russia itself. So, and then there is the question about rationality. I mean, not wanting to spend too much time on this, but clearly there are those who look at the way that President Putin's been behaving in the last few months and do wonder whether he's entirely rational. On the other hand, there are others, and most recently I heard the Finnish president say this in an interview on TV, that maybe Putin wants us to think that he isn't rational, and therefore we will be even more cautious, in his hope, in the way we react to his own escalation. So what I can say is that for the past few years, Russians have been increasingly writing about and talking about the possibility of a limited nuclear war. And I've had these discussions with Russian colleagues, and you just sort of scratch your head and say, why are they writing this? I think what people are concerned about is the potential use of a tactical nuclear weapon, not an all-out, thermonuclear war with long-range strategic missiles. And I think you can't rule it out. I mean, having said that, again, the consequences even of the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, would be tremendous and would be awful. But I think you can't say with 100% certainty that things couldn't escalate when you listen to Putin and you see what Russia is doing. And I know that in Europe, I think people are more concerned about that, maybe in the United States, just because they're so much nearer. I mean, I haven't heard Europeans until recently talk about the danger of a potential nuclear war. Now, in terms of the sanctions, I happen to be at a conference at the moment where there's some Russian participants and none of them can use their credit cards anymore. So an immediate impact of the sanctions are on the admittedly more urban, educated middle class, and they've already lost access to using credit cards or Western ones for any form of payment. The Russian people will feel the impact of these sanctions. They may not feel them immediately, but clearly they are going to feel with the sanctioning of all the banks, with the difficulty of accessing, anything but rubles. And eventually there will be, more inflation. I mean, Russia was already suffering from it. But the problem with, the ordinary Russians, by the way, a majority of whom still support this war because they don't know any better and because they don't have any images of the war in their own state-controlled media. But when they do feel the pinch, Putin will presumably do what he did in 2014 after the sanctions were imposed after Crimea and say, it's the West's fault. They're trying to starve us out, but we brave Russians, we can survive this. We survived the siege of Leningrad in World War II. We'll tighten our belts. So they will be told that it's all the West's fault. Now, let's look at the oligarchs for a moment. So, of course, they're unhappy, the big ones, about losing, their yachts, their apartments, their bank accounts, whatever, in Europe and in the United States. They will certainly feel the pinch, but there's not very much they can do about it. And, the idea that they're going to get together and then say, well, we obviously have to have a different leader if we want to regain access to all these things. That's not how the Russian system works. So they may be disgruntled, but there's a limit to what they can do. Further down the road, the export control sanctions will have a major impact on the Russian economy. The fact that we're not going to export semiconductors and other important parts for the development of Russia's own industrial economy will have a longer term impact, will make it much harder for Russia to develop as an economy, but that's not going to be felt immediately. And so far, the energy sanctions that the United States has put on Russia, that's not going to make much of a dent in Putin's and his cronies' ability to earn lots of money. If the Europeans were able, as they say they want to do, to move away from importing Russian gas and oil, but that will take time, then that would, I think, have more of an impact. But there's always, China and other countries who will be buying Russian energy. But I do think that these are very serious economic sanctions, and they will be felt in the long run in Russia, and they will. And as Russia closes its borders, as it's doing at the moment, it will make Russia more isolated, less modern, and really going back to the situation some of my Russian friends are saying that they were in, at least in the 1970s.
Yeah, we left in 1980, and my parents said, they didn't recall the Soviet Union being this dire and so quickly, right? All things unfolding the way they are even back then. And you're right. I think China is the wild card here, and whether they step in and when they do and how much they do is a big question. Okay, so we have a few minutes left here. Let's turn to questions. Do we expect progress from the meeting of the foreign ministers on Thursday, I believe, in Turkey, correct?
No.
No.
Okay.
No, I remember. I even remember the spring of 2014, after we had they had grabbed Crimea and they were about to have their big operation in the south and the east of Ukraine to really sort of unravel the Ukrainian state. We had meetings with Lavrov, X numbers of them, and at the end of the day, nothing came out of that one. We should understand that sort of the diplomatic machinery of the Russian state is disconnected to a large extent from the real decision-making and from the real centers of power. That was the case in 2014, very clearly, and that seems to be the case now. I mean, mind you, Lavrov is on record of saying X numbers of times during the last few weeks that no invasion whatsoever will ever be done by Russia. Whether he believed that or not, I don't know. But I would not exclude that even he was surprised by what happened.
Yeah, I mean, even his press secretary, who's known to be a loose cannon, had said things along the likes of, just tell me when the war is going to happen so I can plan my holiday trip and all of that. Is the U.S. prepared for crises in Europe simultaneously with one or more in Asia, such as with China or North Korea? Right, we've gotten a little nervous over the past couple of weeks anytime we see a headline of a missile launch right out of North Korea and wonder, oh no, what's he doing over there? But I'm just curious, is this an opportunity that anyone thinks China or North Korea can rear their heads now?
I think it has sort of it has two dimensions to it. Is what's the U.S. capacity to deal with it, and what is the thinking on the part of actors in Asia, whether we are so distracted that they could actually go ahead and do something nefarious. I mean, clearly, we are no longer capable in the way that we were 30, 40 years ago to have a two-front war. In fact, we abandoned the entire idea of having a two-front war in our military strategy, and we still have large capabilities also in the Middle East. That said, what we're doing in order to reinforce in Europe is not coming from either the Middle East or, for that matter, let alone from the Indo-Pacific. And so the military capacity that we maintain around the world remains pretty similar. The intelligence resources and those kinds of things tend to, shift with the times and the needs. And I would assume that what we're doing in terms of intelligence gathering from the Russians and the military in the Ukrainian situation has diverted some resources. But I think there's nothing to believe that our posture would be affected, has been affected by what has happened over the past 2 weeks. Whether the Chinese and, more importantly, the North Koreans are reading the situation right and is a real question. I think the Chinese are probably surprised by the degree of unity that they have seen, and it's not just the United States and Europe. It's also Asian powers. It's Singapore that has put sanctions, really, I mean, of all countries, on the Russians and Switzerland, countries that normally you wouldn't expect to move. They must look at that and say, wait, this is pretty serious in terms of that capability. I do worry about the North Koreans. I always worry about the North Koreans. There's an election going on right now in South Korea. So there's a transition in South Korea with two people who are not known for their foreign policy chops vying for the presidency. And if you're Kim Jong-un and you're looking around and think that people are distracted, maybe this is the right time to, I don't know, do something, nuclear test, what have you. He's perfectly capable of that kind of behavior.
Well, and if you're Kim Jong-un and you see what's happened the past 2 decades in Ukraine alone, you may wonder, why should I ever contemplate giving up nuclear technology, right, and aspirations?
Right.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and this is the one we're all focused on. How long do you think this war will last? And I will say, as a journalist, as somebody who's covered many crises here, what worries me most is just, viewers have short attention spans, right? And people go on with their lives. And so we're following day to day what's happening and the unbelievable destruction that we're seeing there and the mass exodus of refugees and these, heartwarming and just emotional pleas from Zelensky. But I do wonder, how long can viewers maintain their attention to this conflict, and what does that mean for those who are suffering now? So I'll have maybe all three of you weigh in.
Well, I think this war could last a long time. The Russians aren't going to retreat. It may take them much longer than they think to capture Kyiv, but as Ivo has already said, they do have the superior military power to Ukraine, vastly superior, even if it hasn't functioned that well. And I, like you, I'm concerned that eventually people will tire of reading these horrible stories every day, watching them on CNN about what's happening there, and their attention will be, elsewhere. And that will probably leave the Ukrainians more vulnerable.
I think in the one form of that this war, this conflict is going to go on until Vladimir Putin leaves the Kremlin. Because even if you were to have a pause or something here, win or no win or petition or whatever, as long as he is there, he's going to continue the one way or the other and be revengeful against all of those who have Ukraine and Zelensky. He is deeply embedded with his own thoughts of what he wants to achieve, and I don't think he has any intention to give that up as long as he sits in the Kremlin.
Yeah, I agree with that, and so I think it's going to take a long time. I don't think this is over until Putin is no longer capable of directing the Russian state. I agree with Carl on that, and so I think our leadership really needs to work on preparing for the long game. In the first 14 days, all the focus is about how do we help Ukraine and deal with the immediate situation. That is the right focus. But we now need what the Germans call the Gestalt shift. We really need, this is a paradigm shift. This is a moment that are rare in history. It's December 7th. It's November 9th or September 11th in terms of the change. I think that's happening in Europe more than it is in the United States. I really we need to see our leaders preparing for the long game. This is not going to go away for any time soon. And by the way, even if Putin is gone, you still have the China issue that is with us. And so we really need to think about a new way of dealing with a new competition in which we understand that what's happening in the outside world really has fundamental implications for us at home. And our ability to get on with our lives depend on doing the right thing and having the right strategy to deal with these challenges that we face.
When you're talking about the long game, Putin could theoretically be in office until 2036. Do you view his power any weaker today than it was 3 weeks ago? Angela?
Not that we can see. Obviously, you hear rumors now about some in the military who are questioning what's going on here, even possibly in the intelligence services. But these are all rumors. And he looks at the moment, as if he's firmly in power there with the 3 or 4 people who are talking to him wherever he is sitting. But having said that, as someone who's been studying Russia all of my professional life, we all get surprised. So one day, this may not be the case, and he may be gone from the scene.
We should just note those around him, those Siloviki, are all pretty much like-minded people, right? Yeah. So no sense of enlightenment there. Okay, well, this has been frightening and very, very thoughtful. And I think, listen, I hope we can keep this up for however long this conflict goes. I'm happy to do this every few weeks with you all and catch your viewers and members up to speed with your great analysis. So thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Ivo, Carl, Angela, it's been great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
you.
all. Thanks.
Thanks.